Hello again. It's me with another excerpt from White Silence. And just a quick reminder that the fourth one in the series, Elizabeth Cage, Moon, is out next year on the 22nd of May. I remembered. This is another extract a little further on in the story. Elizabeth has been kidnapped, I suppose, is the word we're looking for, after her husband's funeral, because there are people out there who very much want to get their hands on her. She's been imprisoned in a secure mental establishment and she's met Michael Jones. The two of them have already managed to get themselves in trouble, and now we're about to find out what happens next. So off we go. Jones came in just after me, settled himself in an armchair, and read his newspaper while I concentrated on my book. A lot of people just stared into space, lost in their own unhappy thoughts. There were no staff present. I gathered there was a kind of gentleman's agreement. We would sit quietly and behave ourselves while they had their evening meal and wrote up their notes. I finished my coffee, holding up my book as a shield against the world. I was reading Three Men in a Boat, normally a source of comfort and enjoyment to me. I was just thinking it had never seemed less funny when it happened. 1 minute everything was perfectly normal, and then, without any sort of warning, the page darkened in front of my eyes, and for a moment the world swam away from me. My first thought was that I was having some sort of neural event. The second was that Sorensen had drugged the coffee and somehow I hadn't noticed. The third was that I was going to be horribly sick. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving my skin cold and tight. My book fell from my hands, bounced in my lap and dropped to the floor. Instinctively, I bent to pick it up, and as I did so, a head appeared through the wall at the far end of the room. I was still leaning down, and we were on the same level. The lighting was good. My eyesight is good. There was no mistake. A head was slowly emerging from the wall at floor level. I picked up the book and shot a swift glance around the room. No one was taking any notice of anything at all. Everything was perfectly normal. People were drinking coffee and sitting quietly, and all the time, a head was coming through the wall. It was obvious no one else could see it because there was no screaming and running, which there certainly would have been if it had been visible to anyone else, because it was hideously ugly, frighteningly so. The head was hairless and eyeless. The skin burned black in places, and it was coming through the wall. Shoulders followed, and then first one bony stick that turned out to be an arm, and then another, pulling itself silently through the wall and into the room. Around me, I could hear the gentle murmur of voices as the crossword puzzlers got into their stride, while ahead of me, the creature was nearly through, dragging itself with painful slowness across the old parquet floor. The smell was awful. I felt my stomach heave. Burned meat. Not in itself an offensive smell, but this was burned human, a badly burned human. A few scorched rags of clothing were visible on its upper body, apparently seared into the flesh by a fire. From the waist down, everything was burned black and twisted. There were no legs. Wherever and whenever this person had burned, the fire had started at the legs, which were completely burned away. Only two blackened stumps remained, terminating just below the knee. The feet were completely gone. Slowly and with great determination, it pulled itself across the floor. I could hear the scrape of bone on wood. I could see the strain as it raised itself on stick-like forearms, dragged itself another inch or so, rested a moment, and then did it again, and again, and again. I glanced around. Everyone was completely immersed in their own world, completely oblivious to this creature, this monster, which would surely send them all screaming from the room if they had any idea it was here. And what did I do? I was an unwilling inmate in a secure mental establishment, and the last thing I needed to do was to run to a member of staff and tell them an invisible monster had just crawled through the wall. That sort of thing does not get you released the next morning. Actually, I was wrong. Someone was watching, but he was watching me, not the thing on the floor. Jones had lowered his newspaper and was staring at me. I didn't have time for him right now because the creature had stopped. Now, almost in the center of the room, it paused and looked around. An eyeless skull it might be, but it could see, I was certain of it. For what or whom it was looking, I had no idea. I remember offering up a fervent prayer that it wasn't me. Apparently, it wasn't. It shifted slightly on its elbows and set off in a new direction. It had located its prey. A man sat some 12 or 15 feet away from me, alone in an armchair pulled well away from everyone else. His coffee sat untasted at his elbow as he stared sightlessly at something only he could see. Occasionally, his right hand would twitch with a life of its own. His colour was dreadful. What had, I suspected, been a soft, gentle blue had deteriorated to a thin, muddy yellow. Occasionally, it gave a little flutter that reminded me of a dying bird. A black patch sat over his heart, tenuously connected to another black patch around his head. Even as I watched, his whole colour grew darker and dimmer. There wasn't much of it left. I jerked my eyes back to the creature, which now, apparently, with great pain and effort, was crawling towards him. As I watched, it reached out a blackened claw and seized the man's ankle. He gave no sign he knew what was going on, but the sad remains of his colour swirled downwards and towards the creature and enveloped it. With an abrupt movement, he thrust back his chair and got up. He stood for a moment as if, having got this far, he was unsure what to do next. Then he turned and slowly walked towards the door, seemingly unaware of the thing he was dragging behind him. They had to pass me to get to the door. Instinctively, I drew my feet back well out of the way, and as I did so, the creature turned its head and looked at me. For a long second, we stared at each other. It had no eyes, but I knew that somehow it could see, and it was seeing me now. I clutched my book as if my life depended upon it, and then it was gone, dragged towards the door by a man who had no idea it was there. I didn't know what to do. I really didn't know what to do. My dad used to say I saw things for a reason, and that reason would become clear one day. It hadn't yet. Was this that day? But what could I say? What could I do? I had to do something. No matter what sort of trouble it got me into, I couldn't do nothing. My dad wouldn't have liked that. I made my way to the door and looked out. The man was already halfway up the stairs, moving slowly and heavily, leaning on the banisters. His colour had almost completely disappeared. I ran to the reception desk. The receptionist looked up in surprise. I wasn't famed for chatting to the staff. "Mrs. Cage, what can I do for you?" "That man," I pointed. "Yes." "I don't think he's very well." "Really? In what way?" What could I say? He seemed agitated, distressed even, and he left very suddenly. His behaviour made me uneasy. He stared after the man, now disappearing round the landing, but made no move to get up or pick up a phone. "I think someone should check it out," I said. "I'll certainly mention it to the duty nurse." Well, that was no good. I sought for something to say, something that would galvanize them into action. I thought I saw him slip something into his pocket. Suicide was a big fear here. There were people here on suicide watch who never had a member of staff further than 3 feet away from them. We were all checked hourly at night, a torch appearing briefly through the dark. There would be a pause as someone made the appropriate annotation on a clipboard, and then the torch would move away again. Oh, did you see what it was? Oh, now what did I say? I was spared the trouble. Michael Jones stood behind me. Is there a problem here? Mrs. Cage has some concerns about a patient. Which one? Mr. Johnson. Then I suggest you check it out. The duty nurse. Now. I jumped at the tone in his voice, and the receptionist reluctantly reached for the telephone. I moved away. I'd done my duty. They could all sort it out among themselves. I wanted to be alone to think about what I'd just seen and have a quick cup of tea and wait for my heart rate to return to normal as well.